Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to NYPAY's. This is our third Zoom virtual meeting, and this will be on AI and ethics. I'm going to ask everybody to please turn off your video to preserve bandwidth, and keep yourself muted unless you want to ask a question. You can also pose a question in the chat bar. Click the chat at the bottom of your control panel to see that chat bar and to pose questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Pat Raufer.
Hi, everybody. Real excited to be hosting this session today. So I think probably everybody has been seeing a lot of discussion and activity around AI and new technologies. The spin that I'd like to be taking a look at is the actual application from an ethics standpoint, because it's one thing to have the technologies, but it's another thing to make sure that they are up to speed in terms of being actually ethical and making sure they do no harm or as little harm as possible. And so to that end, I've invited a couple of people to join us. So I'm going to ask them to do their own introduction, if you will, to explain their background. But we have Amgad who is an AI product lead, and he's a specialist in deep learning and ML technology. We have Reed Blackman, who is the CEO of Virtual Consultants and a member of an EY advisory board, and Yuri Ribner, Chief Cyber Officer and co-founder of Biotech. So if you could give a little bit more detail as to your particular perspective from a AI and ethics standpoint, I'd appreciate it. So Amgad, please.
Right. Patricia, so yeah, so for, are we going through introduction first, or are you going for the questions directly?
No, if we could go through it, like what your background, like what you specifically focus on.
Yeah, right. So my name is Amgad Mohammed. I'm an AI practitioner. I have 15 years of experience spanning data science, engineering, and product management. I'm focusing on enterprise AI and building, helping companies to build AI products. In my latest role, I was a product lead, AI product lead for what we call a fin crime interdiction platform, where we are helping citizen data scientists and analysts to use machine learning to fight financial crime. I've also authored a book about computer vision, which is a field of AI specifically, and helping Android developers to build intelligent apps. I've also have award-winning publications in the field of deep learning, with also focus on computer vision.
Thank you. Reed, please, a little more detail on your background.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia, and thanks everyone for having me. So my name is Reed Blackman. I'm the founder and CEO of Virtual Consultants. It's an ethics consultancy. So what I do in that capacity is I help senior leaders to operationalize data and AI ethics. So AI ethics, or ethics generally, seems to be, sometimes it's described as fuzzy or squishy, and people don't really know what to do with it. So I help them figure out how to make it more concrete and bake it into process and infrastructure. My background is not as an engineer. I was a philosophy professor for a decade, specializing in ethics. And I left academia and started helping companies about 2 years ago.
And my name is Yuri. I'm Chief Cyber Officer for Biotech. I was working for a big security company called RSA that was hacked by a big foreign state. It was a very famous story on the news about 10 years ago. Was looking for interesting new capabilities, came across behavioral biometrics from a new company called Biotech, and at some point they invited me to join as a co-founder. I've been fighting online fraud for 20 years, and without AI, we would have been helpless as an industry. It's really something that we need. We are the good guys, we're fighting the bad guys, and hopefully we use ethical technologies. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So let's get started in terms of where do you think the AI is most likely to be used ethically versus not ethically? Can you give me applications of how it could be used ethically and then how it can be used not ethically?
I could give some sort of, if you'd like a sort of broad overview of the standard ways where things get ethically messed up. Would that be helpful?
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Look, so one thing to say that in conversations like this is when people talk about AI ethics is that there's really two sides to the coin of AI ethics. On the one side of the coin is AI for good. So how do we use the power of AI to make good things in the world, have a positive social impact? And that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is risk mitigation. It's how do we, it's AI for not bad. How do we use AI and all of its power for whatever sort of, at least ethically acceptable, if not ethically noble goals that we have, like determining, whether someone ought to get a mortgage or something. How do we do that in a way that doesn't create ethical havoc, which is of course for companies reputational risk, and it's also regulatory and legal risk. So how do we produce and deploy AI in an ethically, reputationally safe way? And then there are really three main things to look out for when it comes to this. This is just very broad, not particular to cases, but we're concerned generally about privacy, because most of AI right now is machine learning, and most of machine learning works by using a tremendous amount of data. So often people's data, personal data. And so the fuel of machine learning / most of AI is people's data, which means that developers are incentivized to collect as much as possible, which can lead to privacy violations. So that's one of the major concerns, one of the major potential ethical pitfalls. Another one is bias. So we can get into more detail later, but there are ways of unintentionally, through no intention or even discriminatory attitudes of the product developers, there's a way of creating biased or discriminatory AI algorithms. So for instance, an algorithm that determines whether someone is creditworthy that discriminates against women. That would be an example of a biased algorithm. And then the third thing that often comes up is explainability. That is to say, whether we can actually explain how these algorithms take all this complicated data and output, say, yes to a mortgage or no to a mortgage. How does it come to that output? And if we can't explain it, then it's a black box, which is arguably ethically problematic. So privacy, bias, and explainability are sort of the three main ethical red flags when it comes to contemporary AI.
So when is it good AI and when is it bad AI? So can you give some examples of things that would have been decided in a certain way, but ended up, because of the AI, it ended up being okay? Like, are there examples where AI really is the sort of the savior?
Maybe I can provide an example from the fraud fighting world. Account opening fraud today is the #1 fraud problem in the US because of all of the data hacks. But beyond data hacks, meaning that the criminals have all of the know your customer data for every American citizen. So it's very easy to open a credit card account or a bank account these days on behalf of someone else. There's also a big issue of synthetic identities. In the synthetic identities, what they do is they take a social security number that is still not in the system. So maybe like a child's social security number, attach a name that they make up, attach a date of birth, create a fake identity. Then they have a way to essentially nurture this identity and make sure that this non-existent person now has a credit score and some credit activities that are all positive. Very clever cyber gangs are doing this these days, and the banks are trying to fight it. Now, the way to fight it today is mostly around signals, red flags. Specifically, one of the big credit issuers in the US was looking at a particular application, like an onboarding process. Someone wanted to have a credit card account. It was a 31-year-old person, very thin credit history, no driver's license, social security number was issued only a few years ago, which in itself is very suspicious. Because of all of these, it was suspicious as synthetic identities. Now, in this case, the only remedy is to essentially be very aggressive and ask for tax records and employment records and really try to grill that user. Hopefully, if it's a criminal, they'll go away. The problem is that 95% of the good users also don't proceed because it's very, very, very cumbersome to do that at that point. Now, there is a technology called behavior biometrics that uses AI that looked at totally different things. So for example, the fact that the user that was filling all of this information was quite familiar with all of the data, with their name, date of birth, even the social security number that was issued a few years ago. The way they typed it was very, very familiar to them. They also checked things before they actually started to do the application, like check the rates and fees and things like that. Now, none of these specific elements are indicative enough to say whether it's a synthetic identity or not. But if you combine everything that you know in an AI model, the AI model is much, much better than all of the red flags. In that particular case, the AI was saying, we believe, the AI, I believe, the AI, that this is a good user. The bank then investigated further and found that this was an immigrant, came to the US a few years ago. And essentially, this explains all of this, the thin file, the social security that was issued a few years ago, etc. Without the AI, they would have discriminated against that person. With the AI, now they have a good customer. And actually, this is a person that is now working for the high-tech sector in San Francisco. So this is an example of why AI can be beneficial and like the opposite of unethical.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I just want to maybe merge the two questions together. So what is a good AI versus what is a bad AI, and what are the examples for this? And I find it very easily if we think in frameworks, right? So ethical frameworks can have maybe 4 basic guidelines I would like to think of. Are we doing good? Are we minimizing harm? And are we protecting human autonomy? And are we being fair, right? So if we have this basic guidelines and we try to benchmark this AI technology against those guidelines, like any other technology we have invented before, right? Then we have some sort of a framework that can be used to decide on how ethical this AI application versus another. And to again, going back to the point that Reed mentioned about explainability, without having this kind of transparency around the reasons why AI is making these decisions and what is the intrinsic properties of those AI systems, we cannot judge and we cannot benchmark those AI across those 4 basic guidelines that I referred to.
So what does that mean for regulation?
So so these different guidelines, if you think about it, have some questions that will be addressing the specific stakeholders. So from every different stakeholder we have, from a regulatory perspective, for example, we want to understand if you as a customer, we want to protect you as a customer, and if you as a customer have been subject to automated decision making, you are entitled to be to an explanation. And this brings us back to if you are deploying AI in production and making decisions, this AI has to be explainable, has to be transparent, has to be understandable by human beings. And this is basically what it could mean for regulators from a transparency perspective.
So, maybe I'd like to sort of jump in there, Patricia. So
yeah, sure.
That's all right. So, so one of the big issues is bias. And so to take a case from the financial services industry, if Goldman is currently under investigation for allegedly discriminating against women and setting credit limits with the Apple Card. So the idea is that they train their AI to make predictions about, what kind of, how creditworthy individuals are, and then assign credit limits. And it looks like, or at least it's alleged, and they're being investigated by regulators, that they discriminated against women by giving them smaller credit ratings, even though they have what it seems like identical financial records as men. Okay, so that's case of bias. To dovetail that with what Amgad said, who mentioned fairness as a core principle of good AI, we want to make sure that we're not biased or that we're giving fair outputs. Okay, so then you go, the question is, how do you get fair outputs? How can product developers actually do that? And it turns out it's extremely complicated. So you go to the computer science literature where there's a burgeoning field called fairness in machine learning. And they're trying to figure out what are the formulas that we can use to determine whether the output of an AI is fair in determining, say, who gets a mortgage or what their credit limit's going to be or whatever, right? What kind of advice you give them if it's like a robo advisor, what kind of advice you give them. You want to make sure that's not biased. The problem though is that there are currently over 24 quote unquote definitions of fairness in the machine learning literature. And we can talk about what those look like. For instance, trying to make sure that false negatives are equal across subpopulations, or perhaps you want false positives equal across various subpopulations. There's various ways to cash this out. It turns out that those things are not, these definitions of fairness are often not compatible with each other. And so when you talk about, to answer your question about regulation, how do we regulate this? It's not enough to simply say, make sure that your AI is fair, because there are loads of definitions of fairness in the computer science literature. They're not compatible with each other. And lastly, as this is coming from my perspective as an ethicist, they are not exhaustive of the ways that we ought to be measuring fairness, or ought to be rather thinking about fairness. There are certain kinds of qualitative assessments that escape our ability to quantify. So regulation is really hard, precisely because there's no settled answer about what constitutes fair outputs. And in fact, it's extremely unlikely that we will have a single answer to what constitutes a fair output.
I have a question to read. In a discussion I had with one of the big banks in the US, they were saying that because of anti-discrimination laws, it's very difficult for them to use any machine learning for credit decisioning. By the way, unlike fintech, but that's a separate story. And they said that when they actually look at the models, right, they have built machine learning models that are far better in terms of predicting, credit worthiness, etc. When they look at the models, they identify things that are quite quite indicative. And I'm going to ask you, do you think they're fair or ethical to use? Okay. One example that they gave, which I think is a good one, is that if you're as a US citizen, if you own an iPhone, like if you apply, let's say, using an iPhone versus if you apply using an Android device, you have a better chance of giving back the loan if you apply from an iPhone than if you apply from an Android device. So just this very small fact, is it ethical for a bank to use this data point, or it's completely unethical, and why?
Right, great question. I probably need to learn more details about the case and probably give it more thought. On the face of it, it seems like it would be okay, right? So let me just say why, raise an issue about, or point out why some people will find it problematic. So it looks like, look, it's a predictor. It's a good predictor. Let's just stipulate that's the case. And it doesn't look like it's discriminatory in any way. So what's the issue, right? Okay, so then there are two kinds of questions. One is what ought the bank to do? Would it be ethically okay for the bank to do it? And then there's a different kind of question, which is, would it be okay for regulators to regulate against it? And it might turn out that given the interests and responsibilities of a bank or a financial institution, it's okay, but given the responsibilities of the state, it's not okay. So what people ought to do, or what they're permitted to do, will hinge upon the responsibilities that they have, and their responsibilities will vary by their place in society. So that's one thing to flag. Now, in connection with that, iPhones are really expensive. Certainly relative to other phones on the market. And so what you'll find is wealthier people tend to own iPhones. You'll also find, for various reasons, at least in the US, wealthier people tend to be white. Why is that? Very controversial, but part of that story will be historical discrimination against people of color and their access to capital, yada, 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 right? There's a whole big story to tell. And so then you say, so look, what is happening here if we let the iPhone, possessing an iPhone serve as a predictor, is that it's going to be a kind of proxy for being white. And so we're going to get discrimination against people of color because using that as a predictor will have an adverse impact. First, it'll have a disparate impact on, say, whites versus blacks, and it'll be adverse against the minority population. And so it's unjust. So now what should the bank do? There's lots to say here, and I don't want to put people to sleep, so I probably won't say it right now. But one thing I want to flag is that I just want to reiterate that distinction between what would it be okay for the bank to do from an ethical perspective, given its role and responsibilities in society, and what would it be okay for the state to do, given its role and responsibilities. And we might come to very different conclusions about those things.
Okay, thanks.
So we had a question from the audience, which is that all of the banks are audited frequently with like CFPB, fair lending, et cetera. Have the federal agencies incorporated AI into their tests and assessments? I don't happen to know that. Does anybody on the panel know that, or is that something that we'd have to ask the rest of our attendees?
I have like, indirect evidence that they are beginning to look at this. They're also beginning to look at things like model governance. And is this something that the banks are doing? And explainability. So, regulators are learning about these new types of technologies. And my sense is that they are starting to do this. Is it like a fully baked sort of exercise? Do they know what there is to know about this subject? I don't know. But talking to some of the banks, they did mention that this is something that is beginning to happen, and some questions that are beginning to be asked, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, I think because of what Reed was saying, there's also a lot of conservatism in using AI for these sort of things because of all of the existing regulation and the sense that it will take a lot of effort to convince the regulators that actually it's fine, right? So on one hand, my sense is that there is some sort of movement, but at the same time, no one in the banking sector wants to be the first to kind of challenge that.
So what are you finding with fintechs? Is that the same kind of thing, or how has the adoption of AI in the fintech space? What is your experience with that?
Yeah, I think it's the Wild West. Fintech is the frontier, right? Fintech is using AI left and right to make any kind of decisions. They don't care right now about ethics and regulation because they're not regulated. If a fintech is becoming a bank, which happened, I think, only in one case of a bank in California, then all of a sudden they are starting to look at this. Otherwise, they basically want to maximize their profits. So I think they would do some things like explainable AI, etc., because of other reasons, but not because of regulation or ethics, but rather because of things like model governance, making sure that if something changes, you can explain to yourself. There's the good example of autonomous cars and the fact that some of the models of the machine learning that these manufacturers are using are based on deep learning. Some of them are based on machine learning, and there's a huge difference in explainability. So people are beginning to be aware of that, and because of that, they almost naturally put some additional limitations on themselves. But at the same time, it's very, very far from what we see in the banking sector.
So, David, did you want to come off mute? Dave True? Because you were asking about fintechs. Go ahead. Oh. You're not off mute, so.
How about now?
Oh,
Can you hear me?
Good.
Okay,
Right.
good. Sorry. So, particularly in the U.S., and this is a majority U.S. focused audience, regulation lags. I think that's the case everywhere around the world. So we have things moving pretty quickly in the fintech space. Uri, from one of the points you made, it sounds like if a fintech is not a regulated institution, they don't really care. And the ancillary point is this begs for some, in my opinion, some sort of oversight. And where would that oversight come from? And have you seen anyone providing informed oversight?
Okay, so it's a good question. And by the way, it's very interesting when you talk to fintech companies and when you talk to banks. The banks envy the fintechs and the fintechs envy the banks, but in different ways. So the banks envy the fintechs because it looks like, you know, a free world, no regulation almost. They can do whatever they want. They can use whatever tools. They can be brave and bold and you know, audacious. The fintech world is complaining that the banks are in a better position around credit decisions, fraud decisions, and things like that because they are sharing data. They have a lot of data, the banks, okay, that the fintechs don't. If you're a fintech company, you're typically not connected to a network. The banks are all connected to networks. So it's very interesting to have these conversations. Again, I don't think that at this point, fintechs are concerned about all of this in the sense that they're concerned about ethics or you know, trying to be regulating themselves or getting advice around all of this. But as I said, they are concerned about other things, meaning that the outcome might be a little bit similar, but not the same as the banks. So I don't see, you know, regulators going after fintech companies around these issues because at the end of the day, it's a decision. A fintech company, let's say that is lending money, can remain a fintech or become a bank. If they become a bank, it's some sort of advancement, okay? It's almost like they have a seat at the table. They have access to some resources and knowledge and capabilities that the banks have and they don't, right? So some of the fintech companies are looking into doing that. And by doing that, take all of the responsibility, all of the regulation and compliance. Other fintech companies are happy where they are. So I think maybe Reed was touching a point, the role of states, okay? Obviously, everyone now has to comply with the California Privacy Act and many other privacy acts, etc. It could be that on a state level, there will be some ethics, you know, AI ethics regulatory controls that the states will begin to impose. But at this point, it's a little bit far ahead, I would say. I don't know if
that helped. When you say states, and you're in Israel right now, so we think of you know, the U.S. has state by state regulation as opposed to a federal level. That's one of the crazy things about the U.S. Were you thinking of the national level or at a state by state level, or could be either one?
State by state, and state by state is driving a lot of the investment in regulatory controls these days.
Yeah, okay? Agreed.
California
is there, okay, so California, has California put forth anything related to AI? I apologize, I should know these things, but you know, I know all the privacy stuff that they've done. But do you know of any US state that's actually started thinking about AI?
I don't, maybe the other folks.
Anybody else?
I mean, there's a little. So first of all, there's stuff around data as opposed to, you know, which is sort of, you know, on the way towards machine learning or AI. So you have CCPA in California,
right?
Of course, your GDPR,
which is kind of being adopted by a handful of other states, is it not?
Yeah, it's beginning to sort of you know, move along. Illinois has something that predates CCPA. That's related to collection of personal data of residents of Illinois. And then you have regulations on the local level against particular AI technologies. So most popularly, facial recognition technology has been, you know, barred in various municipalities. So for instance,
because it's in your face. Sorry, I couldn't resist saying that.
Yeah, I mean, the facial recognition is really sort of a hot topic now in terms of what's getting banned by local governments. One, due to surveillance concerns, and two, due to concerns related to bias, because the facial recognition systems tend to be biased against. They have a worse time recognizing women and people of color than they do white men. So between not working well by virtue of being discriminatory, and working well and thus making surveillance all the worse, various municipalities are barring it. Europe is much farther along, by the way. They've released the EU has released a white paper on AI regulation, and that's sort of making its rounds through, the nonprofit and corporate world for feedback, and we'll see what comes.
So before I completely shut up, am I on mute now? No, I'm not on mute. So is that white paper? And I don't know of it, so I'm glad you mentioned it. So what would I search for it under? What would I just say? EU AI white paper?
Yeah.
Okay. So is that being are many of the fintechs in Silicon Valley and the hotspots, are they thinking about that? Or are they taking that into account, or are they kind of ignoring it now? Any sense?
My sense is that they're mostly ignoring it. It's not here yet. I mean, there's a subset of fintechs and banks who are taking it really seriously, due to a concern with reputational risk. They don't want to go viral for all the wrong reasons, and the risk of regulatory investigation. So there are companies that are taking it seriously, but then of course there's lots of companies that aren't taking it seriously because in the short term they see profit.
Good. I'll hush now. So Pat, carry on.
Go ahead.
By the way, David, since you asked, and it's a little bit related, one of the heaviest regulations right now in Europe is PSD2, requiring strong customer authentication for every digital transaction.
Which got pushed back a bit.
So there are, so there are like, it's a fascinating sort of conversation between the regulator and everyone else. And everyone else is trying to explain to the regulator that, it's a good idea, but its implication will be disastrous if not done right. And there are many things to consider and many waivers to use. Otherwise, it can kill e-commerce. It can do a lot of damage. So I think that my expectation is whatever is now happening with this white paper, they will receive a lot of comments, a lot of lobbies, a lot of pressure groups from the business side, fintechs and banks and the card associations and everyone will try to explain to them that there are some good things about this, but there are many bad things around this, and they have to be very careful in the way they kind of phrase things and the way they kind of mandate things, etc., etc. It's going to be interesting to see how it eventually concludes, but it will probably be very different from the initial white paper. The implementation will probably take a long time, and all of this is very fascinating. I think PSD2 is a fascinating story on its own to see how it kind of evolved in Europe, and probably will be similar for AI.
So is there differences between the different technologies? So deep learning, for instance, versus machine learning versus AI. So explain the technologies as to how to be thinking of it from an overall ethics perspective. I don't know the differences between the details on the technology, so that would help.
I can start, but maybe Reid and Amjad can continue.
Yeah.
So essentially, you think about two types of technologies. In one type of technology, which is supervised machine learning, you have data scientists that build features. They do some research, they come up with features. Typically a lot of features. If you don't have too many features, there's no need to do an AI. You can just write rules. But typically, if you have hundreds of thousands of features, you cannot really use any kind of rule-based system, and AI is going to be much better. So this is like one option, and this is obviously explainable because at the end of the day, some sort of outcome is derived from all of the calculation, and you can trace it. You can understand what was the main contribution to the final outcome. As opposed to technologies like deep learning, where it's essentially neural networks that look at the raw data and almost like come up with their own features. And in deep learning, it's like several layers of those neural networks. And the final outcome is very removed from the original data set. So it's very difficult, almost impossible, to say, okay, the outcome was because of this or because of that. So deep learning also has another constraint, which is you need a lot of data, more than supervised machine learning. Supervised machine learning, if you have hundreds of samples, it will work. In deep learning, you need more data, and a lot of like good quality data, I would say as well. It's much more sensitive to quality data sources. So that's my experience, and I can tell you that in the banking world, financial sector, there will be very, very specific things where you can use deep learning, but most of the business problems would probably use supervised machine learning because it is explainable. Even if deep learning has more, has a better performance, okay? Again, think about the autonomous cars. Let's say that there is an accident and you have two systems. You have a deep learning system and you have a supervised machine learning system. The engineers in the supervised machine learning system will immediately start to almost like reverse engineer what happened, okay? And get to some results. The engineers in the deep learning system will just say, hey guys, we can't really do that, but the overall performance is much better. So like if you take 1 million miles of travel, we have less accidents than the other guys. It's not the same type of analysis or argument, okay? So on to Reed and Amgad.
Amgad, can you give us some of your best practices or what you've learned from working with machine learning and deep learning, sort of the best practices to be paying attention to as you're creating the products or working with the data?
Right. Yeah. So so going back to when we move from AI, which is you can think of it as a superset of all the algorithm that makes your machine intelligent, right? And then you move to the machine learning, which is a subset of AI that is now we are getting higher performance, but also we are relying on more data, and then the transparency becomes less. And then you move to the deep learning, which is the small subset of these algorithms that is heavily dependent on data, and the transparency there is on the very lower end. You cannot understand why exactly the models is making these decisions, right? So when we want to mitigate these ethical issues from an AI product development perspective, we think of these issues, as I mentioned, across the 4 different guidelines from an ethical framework. And when we focus, for example, on the bias and the fairness of an AI algorithm, you want to think of what can be recoverable, what things or biases that I can fix, and what biases or unfairness that I cannot fix. And this relates to the fix will be in the data itself. So for example, if I am looking at facial recognition systems, the commercial ones, and they are performing really bad when it comes to a color skin, males or females, then the focus here would be to fix this bias by collecting more data to fix this bias issues, right? So we collect more data for dark-skinned people and put it there and retrain our models and so on. So now we have a problem that we can fix by collecting more data. But there's also another part of it where the bias is coming from historical data collected. So for example, once we maybe have a poor neighborhood that had defaulted on loan payments, and that could cause models to be biased to reject loan application from resident of this neighborhood. Right now, maybe the neighborhood become richer, but the historical data says otherwise. So this is something that we cannot fix by gathering more data, because the historical data says there's a bias there towards rejecting loans. So in this case, we have to default to algorithmic fixes. So we know that there's a bias. We probably know that the machine learning model that we have developed have bias symptoms. So we need to be able to capture those bias symptoms and fix them algorithmically. So there are a bunch of literature on how to do that. Maybe some people think of it as try to formulate the fairness problem as an optimization problem and embed that inside your AI so that the model, while you're learning, while you're learning the task in hand, you're also making sure that you are being fair and treating all groups fairly. Some other people revert to what we call post hoc processing. So basically try to, as Reid mentioned in the beginning, try to make a balance across the error rate for different groups. So if I'm making mistakes for poor neighborhoods, I should be making the same amount of mistakes for rich neighborhoods, for example. And then you go for what we call demographic parity. You try to, if I'm building a system that will give you a hiring decision, for example, you want to make sure that the probability of being selected is also equal across different groups, and so on and so forth. And the things that we can recover from data, the things that we can help our, from a practical experience, help our, organization and help our teams is actually to involve more of data governance around data that is specifically used for machine learning. So, for example, by introducing what we call data sheets, and these data sheets can be part of your data governance implementation. And basically, it's a list of questions that dataset producers answer to help dataset consumers. So things about what is the motivation of building these datasets? What is the composition of the dataset that you are collecting? How did you do the collection process? How did you do the labeling? What would be your recommendation of use, and so on and so forth. So these kind of techniques can be, implemented in order to minimize the impact of bias. Unfortunately, we don't have like a 5-point plan that we can typically take and replicate across different organizations. But at least we can fight this by awareness, understanding what are the sources and how can we mitigate each and every source.
So, and it sounds like combination of machine plus human perspective. So it's,
yes.
It's not the go-to of it just being AI is probably not the ultimate. At least that's an understanding. We had a question in the chat here: to speed up adoption, should we ask bureaus to start buying and getting AI data and integrating into the existing data analytics validation and offer output to banks? It seems that they could speed things along more efficiently and openly. So that seems like that would be a solution that would at least start getting to where you're providing good data across many entities. Any thoughts on that kind of a solution to speed up adoption?
Yeah, and Pat, can I just add to that question? I thought it was a little ironic. I was reading a white paper from one of the bureaus, I forget which one, and they were talking about, what a big problem we have with synthetic identity, but they weren't taking any personal responsibility for it. So yes, I think they should be identifying synthetic identities instead of telling banks how to do it themselves, because they can see across,
It's true. Any thoughts? So I think we're getting ready to wrap it up, but I've been reading a book that's called Weapons of Math Destruction, the one by
Kathy O'Neill.
I'm sorry, what's
Kathy O'Neill?
Yeah, the one by Kathy O'Neill, and on one of the sections, she referred to sort of a Hippocratic oath, where it would be for data scientists to be saying, first do no harm, that kind of a thing. So perhaps that's an interesting first step to be thinking about how to take a stand to move forward.
I mean, so look, that's not why we have ethics in healthcare, I don't think. I mean, yes, we have the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, but the way that we've injected ethics into the healthcare industry isn't by making people, super duper promise. It's because we've injected process and practice and infrastructure into it. Right? So for instance, we have ideas about what does privacy look like and what does autonomy look like in the medical context.
So let me stop you 1 second there. When you say we have injected, so I think a lot, I'm probably older than most of you guys. So I'm in this age. in the UK and the US, where we've gone to government should be as small as possible. And I think we're having a reaction against that because there is a role to set playing fields. Just think about when the railroads rolled out across the US. Without eminent domain, they wouldn't have happened. So there's an interplay there. So when you say we have set privacy, where does that come from? Because genetically almost, and I'm misusing that phrase, companies say, don't tell me what to do. So where does that come from, and where should it come from? And do you see it starting to bubble up anywhere?
Well, so look, so we have what you could call ethical risk mitigation in healthcare because of some, because of some really nasty things that doctors did in the past, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Once people caught wind of that, people went nuts because of all the, because it's ethically monstrous. As a result, the government commissioned people to work on medical ethics principles. In fact, they commissioned a philosopher to lead the charge. Those principles eventually got articulated by policymakers and became regulation. So
ultimately, it comes from something other than private industry that has to say.
In the case of healthcare, it did. So when Patricia asked about the Hippocratic Oath, is that the right first step? My response is, that's not what explains the relatively successful bid to inject ethics into healthcare. What explains the relatively successful bid to inject ethics into healthcare is regulation requiring things like IRBs, internal review boards, to make sure that research on humans is ethically acceptable. Ethics committees at hospitals are in place when particularly ethically gray cases come up. There's medical ethicists in academia. They influence policy, and that's how we got ethics into it. It's a matter of baking it into infrastructure, process, and practice, getting informed consent. Hey, before we operate on you, before you perform this medical treatment, there's a piece of paper that you need to read and you need to sign it to make sure that we are treating you in a way that's compatible with your autonomy. That's how you get doctors putting people first. Because historically it was doctor knows best. It was a transition to patient knows best what's for the patient. We got there by injecting process, not by people taking an oath. So this is sort of my way of saying, if you want to get ethics into AI, then it needs to be injected into infrastructure, process, and practice, not promises made by engineers, especially when they lack institutional support. If they lack institutional support and they're putting their careers on the line, if they sort of speak up about an ethical concern they have, we're not going to get to where we need to be.
And that will probably not come from the firms themselves.
In some cases it already is, right? So for instance, you look at Optum Healthcare, who is being investigated by regulators for discriminatory algorithms that allegedly had an AI that recommended that doctors and nurses pay more attention to white patients than to sicker Black patients. That doesn't look good. That's a real reputational risk. They were in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post for this, but they're being investigated by regulators. So they are certainly taking it very seriously now. And other companies are seeing this going on, and they're saying, okay, we don't want to be in the news for the wrong reasons. We don't want to be investigated. That's very expensive for us. Let's see what we can do to inject explainability, respect for privacy, and anti-bias into our AI development. So this stuff is already going on in some companies. One reason it's not in some is because there's a variety of explanations for why they're not all doing it. Of course, part of that is the absence of regulation, but also some of it is lack of know-how. Some of it is lack of ownership of the problem, right? So it's one thing to know that the company has an issue. It's another thing to say that the person in this role with this budget owns that problem to solve it. So there's a variety of explanations, but it's already started to happen. Although regulation is going to be needed to get, massively wide-scale adoption, I would think.
Great. So thanks, everybody. We're going to actually now go to the breakout session. So hopefully you can join us in the breakout rooms. And just so everyone knows, this particular event will also be on the NYPAY channel, the YouTube channel, accessible through nypay.org. And the descriptions of the backgrounds for the panelists will be included in the write-up that's on the NYPAY page. So if you'd like to be in touch with them, it would be through LinkedIn. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to also provide that connection.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pat. I'm going to start the breakouts now. I just want to let everybody know First, the session will be up on YouTube. Usually takes about 48 hours. Just check out our channel on YouTube, search for NYPAY. And right now I'm gonna turn on the breakouts. You'll be going into a smaller room with a group of 7 to 10 people. Give it about 30 seconds. The breakouts will terminate automatically after 30 minutes. So you'll come out then and we'll just wrap up. All right?
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for spending the time with me.
All right.